My dog can find your daughter." The words were spoken gently, almost respectfully. Daniel Whitmore did not turn right away. He stood at the edge of the stone patio, staring toward the open iron gate that separated his perfectly kept backyard from the street beyond. The faint sound of fiddles and laughter drifted in from the Riverside Harvest Festival down the block. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind neighbors described later as beautiful and peaceful. There was nothing peaceful inside Daniel's chest. He turned slowly. Annie stood a few steps behind him. 6 years old. Dark braids tied back neatly, grass stains on her knees. In her small hand, she held the leash of Daisy, the long-eared hound Lily adored. Daniel blinked once, steadying himself. "I'm sorry," he said, voice tight but controlled. "What did you say?" Annie lifted her chin slightly. "My dog can find your daughter." Daniel exhaled through his nose, almost a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "We have security checking the neighborhood," he said carefully. "The police are on their way. There are officers already at the festival entrance." His words came faster. "They have trained dogs, tracking units." He shook his head once, as if correcting a misunderstanding. "This isn't a game, Annie." She didn't flinch. "I know, sir." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. He was a man used to problems that responded to planning, structure, expertise. You hired the best people. You trusted professionals. You did not improvise with hope. "Daisy is a hunting dog," Annie continued quietly. "She follows scent." Daniel glanced down at the hound. Daisy sat calmly, ears relaxed, eyes soft. She looked more like a family pet than a search animal. "Hunting rabbits isn't the same thing," Daniel said, more to himself than to Annie. "This is different." Annie nodded once. "Yes, sir, it is." He noticed something then. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't insisting. She was simply explaining. "She can smell Lily," Annie said. "Every day they play. Lily smells like strawberries and grass, and the soap in your upstairs bathroom." Daniel's jaw tightened. Strawberries. Lily's shampoo. He hadn't known Annie paid attention to things like that. "That doesn't mean she can track her through a crowd," Daniel replied. "There are hundreds of people down there. Food stands, smoke, music. You can't just..." He stopped himself, catching the edge in his tone. He knelt down, bringing himself level with Annie. His voice softened. "You understand this is serious, right?" "Yes, sir. And you think your dog can find her?" "How?" Annie hesitated only a second. "She needs something that smells like Lily." Daniel frowned. "She already smells her all the time. But she needs it strong," Annie said. "Like when my mom makes chili and the whole kitchen smells different. Daisy follows the strongest smell." Daniel studied her face. "What do you mean, something strong?" Annie's eyes brightened just slightly. "Lily's bracelet," she said. "The pink one with the little silver heart. She wears it every day. Or her blue sweater, the one she doesn't let anyone else wear." Daniel felt a flicker of recognition. The bracelet. Lily rarely took it off. It had been a birthday gift. She slept with it on. "She wasn't wearing the sweater," Daniel said automatically. "It's warm." "But the bracelet," Annie replied. "She wore it today." Daniel stood slowly. He remembered fastening it on her wrist that morning when she had asked him to make sure the clasp was tight. She had held her small arm out proudly, as if it were a royal jewel. He swallowed. "And if she dropped it?" he asked suddenly. Annie shook her head. "She wouldn't. She loves it." There was a quiet certainty in that answer that unsettled him more than bold confidence would have. Daniel looked toward the open gate again. The festival music rose and fell with the wind. A burst of applause echoed faintly. Security officers moved along the sidewalk outside the property. Radios crackled. Procedures unfolded the way they were meant to. Order, systems, control. Yet here stood a 6-year-old child offering something that had nothing to do with systems. "Even if I gave Daisy the bracelet," Daniel said carefully, "what makes you think she could follow it through all that noise?" Annie crouched beside Daisy and placed both hands gently along the dog's neck. "Because Daisy listens with her nose," she said, "not her ears." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. For a moment, he almost smiled at the simplicity of it. Then reality returned. "This isn't like following a rabbit trail in the woods," he said quietly. "There are cars, Streets. People. Yes, sir. And if she loses the scent? Annie met his eyes again. Then we keep trying. There it was again, that steady tone. Not stubborn. Not naive. Faith. Daniel looked down at Daisy once more. The hound's tail tapped lightly against the stone, as if sensing the tension in the air. He stood upright and called toward the house. Maria. She appeared in the doorway almost instantly, apron still tied, worry etched across her face. Sir, go to Lily's room, Daniel said. Bring me her jewelry box. The small white one. Maria hesitated only a second before hurrying inside. Daniel turned back to Annie. I'm not promising anything, he said. The professionals are still in charge. Yes, sir. I don't want you running off into a crowd. I won't. And you stay beside me the entire time. Yes, sir. He nodded once, as if formalizing a contract. Maria returned moments later, holding the small white box. Daniel opened it with hands that felt unfamiliar to him. Inside lay the pink bracelet with the silver heart charm. He picked it up carefully. The metal was still warm from Lily's skin. For a second, his composure wavered. He crouched again and held the bracelet out toward Daisy. All right, he murmured, almost to himself. Let's see what you can do. Daisy leaned forward, nose touching the bracelet. She inhaled deeply, once, then again, her body subtly shifting, as if a switch had been turned. Daniel watched, skepticism still anchoring him. He was not a man who believed easily, but as Daisy's ears lifted and her posture sharpened, something inside him loosened just a fraction. Show me, he said quietly, and though he still did not fully believe in a hunting dog's power against the chaos of a crowded festival, he found himself willing just barely to follow. Daniel Whitmore had held the bracelet like it was a fragile piece of evidence, not a child's cheap charm. The pink band looped in his fingers, the tiny silver heart catching the sun for a second, before slipping into shadow as he crouched. Daisy's nose touched the bracelet and stayed there. One long inhale. Another. The hound's posture changed so subtly that Daniel almost missed it. Her ears lifted, no longer relaxed. Her chest expanded, ribs working like bellows. She wasn't excited in the way a pet got excited for treats. She was focused, tuned. Daniel's skepticism didn't vanish. It tightened into something more practical. If this was nonsense, it would become obvious fast. Stay close, he told Annie, forcing his voice into calm. Do not let go of that leash. Annie nodded once. Her small fingers wrapped more firmly around the worn red strap. Maria hovered behind them, hands folded at her waist, eyes darting between Daniel and her daughter. The old instinct of a woman who had spent years measuring the moods of wealthy people. Daniel saw that instinct and, for the first time, it bothered him. This wasn't about status. Not right now. Daisy lifted her head, nose pointed toward the open gate. She rose and took 2 steps, slow and certain. The leash tightened. Annie followed without hesitation. Daniel straightened, phone still in his hand. He tapped the screen and spoke into it. Mark, the gate, he said to his security chief. I'm going out. Keep the perimeter. I want 2 men behind me. No more. A beat of silence. Then, sir, we've got officers arriving. K9 is en route. We should wait. Daniel looked at Daisy, already pulling toward the sidewalk as if she could see the scent like a line in the air. No, Daniel said, and surprised himself with the steadiness of it. We move now. He stepped off the patio and onto the grass, shoes sinking slightly into the manicured lawn. His tie, loosened earlier, flapped faintly in the breeze. He hated feeling disheveled, hated appearing anything less than in control. But the discomfort was distant now, like a complaint from someone else's body. They passed through the iron gate. Outside the estate, the neighborhood felt different, less quiet, more alive. Cars crawled toward the festival. Families walked in clusters, kids tugging at balloon strings. The air smelled like summer and fryer grease. Somewhere, a microphone squealed briefly, and laughter followed. Daisy moved forward, nose low, then suddenly angled left, pulling toward the corner where the sidewalk met the street. Daniel's mind ran ahead with its usual calculations. Distance to festival, crowd density, cross streets, risk points. He had built buildings by imagining every possible failure before it happened. It was why his company rarely lost money. It was why investors trusted him. It was also why he didn't like this. He didn't like the feeling of following something he couldn't measure. Annie's small feet pattered beside him, keeping pace, hair braids bouncing. She kept both hands on the leash, her face solemn. "Annie," Daniel said, "how far has Daisy tracked before?" Annie glanced up briefly. "Far," she answered. "When Mr. Keller's beagle got out, Daisy found it by the creek." A beagle by the creek, Daniel thought. Not exactly a child in a festival crowd. Still, Daisy wasn't wandering. She was reading something invisible. They reached the first intersection. A volunteer in a fluorescent vest held up a hand, directing slow traffic toward the church parking lot where the festival had been set up. Daisy stopped at the curb, nose sweeping back and forth like a metronome. She circled once, then pointed her head straight toward the festival entrance and surged forward. "Easy," Daniel muttered automatically, even though it wasn't his dog. Annie tightened her grip. "Daisy," she said softly, not pleading, just reminding. The hound slowed a fraction, then continued. Two security men followed behind at Daniel's command, hands near their radios. Daniel noticed the way passers-by looked at them. At him, the white shirt, the expensive watch, the men who moved like they belonged to a different kind of world. He was used to being noticed. He usually enjoyed it in a detached way. Today it felt like a spotlight on his helplessness. As they neared the festival, sound thickened. Music from the stage rolled across the pavement in warm waves. Children shrieked near the inflatable slide. A vendor called out prices. Funnel cake, lemonade, hot dogs, and the smell of cinnamon and grilled onions punched through the air. Daisy's nose snapped up, and she hesitated. Daniel's stomach tightened. There it is, he thought. The moment reality catches up. Daisy lowered her head again and pushed forward into the crowd. People stepped aside, some with smiles, some with mild irritation at being nudged. A woman laughed. "Big dog," she called, then noticed Daniel's face and stopped laughing. Daniel tried to keep his pace even. He didn't shove. He didn't bark orders. He moved with a controlled urgency that made people part instinctively, like water around a stone. At the festival entrance, a police cruiser had just pulled up. An officer stepped out, already scanning the crowd. Daniel raised a hand. "Officer, my daughter." The officer held up a palm. "Sir, I'm Officer Riley. We're setting up a search radius." "What's her name?" Daniel opened his mouth, but Daisy tugged harder, pulling Annie toward the row of food trucks. Annie looked up at Daniel, and for the first time her voice carried a small crack of fear. "Sir." "Daisy's working." Daniel's throat tightened. He nodded to the officer, forcing himself to speak like a rational adult. "I'm Daniel Whitmore," he said quickly. "My daughter's name is Lily. 7. Blonde curls. She was in our yard. I believe she walked toward the festival. We're following our dog." Riley's eyes flicked to Daisy. "A dog?" "A hound," Daniel corrected, almost defensively, then hated that he felt the need to justify anything. "She knows Lily's scent." Riley's expression didn't change much, but Daniel saw skepticism there, the kind he was accustomed to in negotiations when someone thought he was bluffing. "We have K9 units on the way," Riley said. "But do what you need to do. Just stay in sight. Don't interfere." Daniel nodded, already moving again. He didn't have the luxury of being offended. Daisy weaved past the funnel cake stand. Her nose dipped toward the ground, then lifted, then dipped again as if tasting the air. Annie kept up, the leash taut like a lifeline. They passed a booth where a middle-aged couple sold homemade jam. The woman smiled at Annie. "Honey, is your dog lost?" Annie shook her head. "No, ma'am," Daniel heard himself say, quieter than he meant to. "We are." The woman's smile softened into concern. She didn't ask more. She simply stepped aside and waved others to make room. That small kindness hit Daniel harder than it should have. His mind flashed back to his own childhood county fairs in Ohio. His father's big hand gripping his shoulder so he wouldn't wander. His father smelling of motor oil and cheap aftershave, saying, "Don't let the noise pull you away, Danny. Noise don't care if you come back." Daniel hadn't thought about that in years. They reached the center aisle of the festival, where the crowd was thickest. Daisy stopped again, head turning left, then right. Her ears rotated, her tail held low but steady. She circled once, twice. Daniel's pulse hammered. He wanted to grab the leash himself, to do something, anything, but he forced his hands to stay at his sides. This wasn't his skill. This wasn't his world. Annie dropped to her knees on the pavement right there in the middle of adults and strollers. She leaned close to Daisy's face and cupped the dog's cheeks, bringing their foreheads nearly together. Her lips moved in a whisper Daniel couldn't hear. He watched, stunned by the tenderness and certainty in that small gesture. A child speaking to a dog like a partner, not a pet. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to let us know. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in stories about hope, courage, and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Daisy inhaled again, deep enough that her ribs showed. Then she jerked her head sharply toward the edge of the festival, toward the quieter street that ran behind the church, and she pulled. Annie sprang up, bracing her feet. "There," Annie said, and her voice was steadier now. Daisy found it. Daniel didn't know what it was: trail, scent, luck, miracle. He only knew that the hound was moving with purpose again. He followed, stepping out of the densest part of the crowd and into a path that opened unexpectedly, as if the day itself was making room. And as they crossed behind the church toward the quieter street, Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle over his skepticism. Not belief, not yet, but the first thin thread of hope strong enough to pull him forward. Daisy did not slow down this time. She pulled hard toward the narrow street behind the church, away from the music and bright tents, away from the smell of sugar and grease. The sudden drop in noise felt like stepping out of a storm into a hollow pocket of air. Daniel's heart thudded in his ears. The street behind the church was lined with old maple trees and a row of parked cars. Fewer people walked here. The festival felt distant, muffled, like a radio turned down in another room. Daisy's nose skimmed the asphalt, then lifted sharply toward a cluster of shrubs near a temporary fence set up for overflow parking. She lunged. "Easy," Daniel said reflexively, but Annie was already bracing. "I've got her," Annie said, breathless but steady. 2 steps later, Daisy barked. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't confused. It was sharp, clear, certain. Daniel froze. The world narrowed to that sound. Beyond the shrubs, near a folding table stacked with cardboard boxes of bottled water, a small figure stood with her back turned. Blonde curls caught in the late afternoon light, a pale blue dress dusted with grass at the hem. Lily. She was staring at a cluster of helium balloons tied to a folding chair, their strings tangled together like bright vines. For half a second, Daniel didn't move. He was afraid that if he blinked, she would disappear. "Lily," he breathed. The name cracked on the way out. She turned. Her face sun-warmed, flushed. A smudge of something sticky near her chin lit up in surprise first, then confusion, then relief so raw it looked almost painful. "Daddy?" Daniel didn't remember crossing the distance between them. One moment he stood rooted to the pavement. The next he was on his knees in the grass beside her, arms wrapping around her small body with a force he didn't know he possessed. She smelled like sunscreen and cotton candy, and strawberries. He pressed his face into her hair, eyes shut tight. "You scared me," he whispered hoarsely. "You scared me, sweetheart. I just wanted to see the music," Lily said into his shoulder, her voice small but unbroken. I could hear it. He pulled back enough to look at her face, scanning for scratches, bruises, fear. There was none. Only a faint confusion at the intensity of his embrace. "You walked too far," he said, voice trembling despite himself. "You can't just follow sound like that." "I know," she said, nodding earnestly. "I thought I could still see the house." The truth of that simple and innocent hit him harder than any crisis boardroom ever had. Children always think they can still see the house. Behind him, Daisy let out a low, satisfied huff. Daniel turned. The hound stood a few feet away, tail wagging in slow, deliberate strokes. Annie stood beside her, breathing hard, cheeks flushed, but her chin lifted with quiet certainty. "She's okay," Annie said softly. Daniel rose slowly. Lily still clutched to his chest. He walked toward Annie and stopped in front of her. For a moment, words failed him again. He had spent decades mastering language negotiations, contracts, speeches at charity galas. Words were tools to him, weapons sometimes. Right now, they felt inadequate. "She found her," Annie said, as if stating the obvious. Daniel swallowed. "Yes," he said. "She did." He looked down at Daisy. "Thank you," he said to the dog, his voice low and steady. Daisy's tail thumped once against Annie's leg. Officer Riley approached from the other end of the street, radio crackling at his shoulder. He slowed when he saw Lily safely in Daniel's arms. "That her?" Riley asked. Daniel nodded. "She's fine." Riley let out a quiet breath. "Good." He looked at Daisy, then Annie. "That's some dog." Annie's hand tightened in Daisy's fur. "She's not just a dog," Annie said matter-of-factly. Riley smiled faintly. "Guess not." The officer stepped aside, already speaking into his radio to cancel the broader search. Daniel turned slightly, still holding Lily. The late sun filtered through the maples, casting long gold shadows across the pavement. The festival music drifted faintly, no longer threatening. The crisis had lasted less than an hour, but something in Daniel felt permanently shifted. He looked at Annie again. "You were right," he said carefully. Annie didn't gloat. She didn't beam. She just nodded once, as if she had never doubted the outcome. "I told you," she said simply. "Daisy remembers people she loves." Daniel felt his throat tighten again. Lily twisted in his arms and spotted Annie. "Annie," she exclaimed. "You came." Annie smiled shyly. "Daisy did," she corrected. Lily squirmed until Daniel lowered her to the ground. The two girls stood facing each other for a moment. Then Lily threw her arms around Annie in a spontaneous hug. Daniel watched it happen. His daughter, in her blue dress and scuffed sandals, hugging the housekeeper's child without hesitation. No hierarchy. No invisible lines drawn. Just relief. Daisy leaned forward and gently licked Lily's hand, as if confirming what her nose already knew. Lily giggled. "She found me." "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "She did." He glanced toward the estate visible in the distance. The tall iron gate, the security cameras, the manicured hedges. All the money in the world had not been what brought Lily back into his arms. It had been a hound, and a 6-year-old girl who refused to be dismissed. Daniel straightened and extended his free hand to Annie. She looked at it, then at him, unsure. He didn't retract it. "Thank you," he said again, this time not rushed, not distracted. "I owe you more than I can say." Annie placed her small hand in his. Her grip was firm. "You don't owe me," she replied. "Lily's my friend." The words landed with quiet weight. Not charity, not transaction. Friend. Daniel released her hand slowly. Maria approached at a hurried pace from the direction of the festival, eyes wide. When she saw Lily safe, she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears springing instantly. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. Daniel met her eyes. "She's safe," he said. Maria nodded, then looked at Annie, then at Daisy. Pride flickered across her tired face. Daniel adjusted Lily on his hip and took a deep breath. "We're going home," he said gently. "All of us." As they began walking back toward the estate together, Lily holding Annie's hand, Daisy padding proudly at their side, Daniel felt the world settle into place again, but not exactly as it had been. Something had shifted. Control, he realized, was not the same as security. And faith in something simple, something loyal, might be stronger than any system money could build. The sun dipped lower behind the church steeple, casting the four of them in long, shared shadow as they crossed back toward the iron gates. For the first time that afternoon, Daniel allowed himself to breathe fully. Lily was safe, because someone he almost didn't believe had believed enough for both of them. The walk back to the Whitmore estate felt different from the frantic rush toward the festival. The air had cooled slightly, late afternoon light turning amber as it slipped between the trees. Lily walked in the middle now, one hand in her father's, the other still clutching Annie's fingers as if letting go might undo everything that had just happened. Daisy padded proudly at their side, head high, tail swaying with quiet satisfaction. Daniel noticed how people looked at them as they passed, first at him, then at Lily, then at the big hound, and finally at Annie. He had spent most of his adult life ignoring the way the world arranged itself around wealth. Today, he could not ignore anything. At the iron gate, Mark stood waiting, posture rigid until he saw Lily's face. Relief softened him instantly. "Sir," Mark said, stepping forward. "We had units covering the north side." "I'm glad. It's handled," Daniel replied, not coldly, but with finality. "Thank you." Mark's eyes flicked briefly toward Daisy, then Annie. He nodded once. Inside the gate, the estate returned to its usual quiet. The fountain in the circular driveway murmured softly. The hedges stood trimmed to geometric perfection. The house itself, all white stone and tall windows, gleamed in the fading light. Lily looked up at her father. "Can Annie come inside?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "She can." Maria slowed a fraction at that, surprised. Annie glanced at her mother for permission. Maria gave a small nod. "Only for a little while," she said gently. Inside, the cool air carried the faint scent of polished wood and lemon cleaner. Lily kicked off her sandals by the door the way she always did, forgetting the house rules in her relief. Daniel didn't correct her. He knelt in front of her instead. "Listen to me," he said softly. "You don't ever leave the yard without telling me. Not for music, not for balloons. Do you understand?" Lily's lower lip trembled slightly, not from fear, but from realizing the weight of what had happened. "I'm sorry, Daddy." He pulled her into another hug, gentler this time. "I know," he murmured. "I know." From the foyer, Annie watched quietly, Daisy sitting beside her like a sentinel. The contrast between Annie's worn sneakers and the marble floor did not go unnoticed by Daniel this time. Neither did the way Annie stood a little straighter. Not shrinking, not intimidated. He rose and walked toward her. "Would you like some lemonade?" he asked. Annie blinked, startled by the directness. "Yes, sir." "Daniel," he corrected automatically, then paused. He wasn't used to correcting children that way. "You can call me Mr. Whitmore." "That's fine." Annie nodded, unsure how to navigate the shift. In the kitchen, sunlight pooled across the Long Island counter. Maria moved with familiar efficiency, retrieving glasses, slicing lemons. Her hands trembled only slightly. "You were brave," Maria whispered to Annie in Spanish, low enough that Daniel pretended not to hear. Annie shook her head. Daisy was. Daniel poured the lemonade himself. It felt strangely grounding, the weight of the pitcher, the clink of ice in glass. Lily slid onto one of the tall stools, swinging her legs. She looked at Daisy. "You're a hero," Lily announced solemnly. Daisy thumped her tail once against the cabinet. Daniel handed Annie a glass. Their fingers brushed briefly. He realized he had never looked closely at her before, not really. Not beyond a polite greeting in the mornings when Maria arrived for work. Her braids were slightly uneven. There was a small scar near her eyebrow. Her eyes, dark and steady, held no trace of doubt about what had just occurred. "You knew," Daniel said quietly. Annie sipped her lemonade, then nodded. She knows people she loves. The simplicity of that statement lodged somewhere deep in his chest. Love, not training, not commands, not status. Love. Lily leaned toward Annie. "When Daisy barked, I knew it was you," she said. "I was looking at the balloons and I heard her and I thought, that's my Annie's dog." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "My Annie's dog." The possessive was not about ownership. It was about belonging. He straightened. "I need to make a call," he said, stepping away toward his office. Inside, the quiet room lined with dark bookshelves and framed degrees, Daniel shut the door and leaned against it for a moment. The adrenaline that had carried him through the search was fading, leaving behind a tremor he could no longer ignore. He moved to his desk and picked up his phone. "Riley," he said when the officer answered. "I want to formally thank your team, and I'd like to make a donation to the Community Safety Fund." There was a pause. "That's appreciated, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel stared out the window toward the distant line of trees. And, he added slowly, "I want to sponsor the K9 unit expansion next quarter." Another pause. "We won't say no to that." After he hung up, Daniel remained still. He wasn't trying to buy redemption. He was trying to acknowledge something he had nearly overlooked. When he returned to the kitchen, the scene stopped him at the doorway. Lily sat on the floor now, her dress fanned around her, showing Annie a picture book. Daisy lay stretched between them, head resting on her paws. Maria stood by the sink, watching her daughter with a softness Daniel hadn't seen before. The house felt different, less like a fortress, more like a home. Daniel stepped forward. "Annie," he said. She looked up immediately. "I was wrong not to believe you," he said plainly. Maria's hands stilled in the sink. Annie tilted her head slightly. "It's okay." "No," Daniel replied gently. "It's not about okay. It's about listening." The words surprised even him. He crouched down so he was level with both girls. "I built my life believing control fixes everything," he said carefully, choosing language they could understand. "Today reminded me that sometimes trust fixes what control can't." Lily leaned against him. "I trust Daisy," she said with certainty. Daniel smiled faintly. "So do I." There was a quiet knock at the back door. Mark stepped in cautiously. "Sir," the media caught wind of the initial call, he said. "They're asking questions." "I told them it was a misunderstanding." Daniel glanced at Annie, at Maria. "Keep it that way," he said firmly. "No statements." Mark nodded and withdrew. Daniel turned back to the girls. "Lily," he said softly. "What do we say?" Lily hopped up and wrapped her arms around Annie again. "Thank you," she said. Then she leaned over and hugged Daisy's thick neck. "And thank you." Daisy exhaled heavily, eyes half closed in contentment. Maria stepped forward, her voice careful. "Mr. Whitmore, we should go. Annie has homework." Daniel stood. "You're welcome here anytime," he said. Maria hesitated, unused to invitations that did not carry obligation. Then she nodded. "Thank you." As they walked toward the door, Lily followed, reluctant to let go. "Can Daisy come again tomorrow?" she asked. Annie looked up at her mother. "We'll see," Maria said gently. Daniel opened the door for them himself. Outside, the sky had shifted to soft lavender. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. Annie paused on the steps and turned back. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said. "Yes?" She wasn't lost for long, Annie said thoughtfully. "Sometimes grown-ups get more scared than kids do." Daniel felt a slow, humbled smile form. "You're right," he admitted. Annie nodded once, satisfied, and walked down the path with Daisy at her side. Daniel stood there watching until the small figures disappeared beyond the hedges. Inside, Lily tugged at his hand. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Next time, can we go to the festival together?" He squeezed her hand. "Yes," he said quietly. Together, and for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore understood that strength was not measured by how tightly you held control, but by who you allowed to stand beside you when you let it go. The next morning felt almost normal. Almost. Sunlight streamed through the tall kitchen windows, glinting off polished countertops and stainless steel appliances. The Whitmore estate woke the way it always did, quietly, efficiently. Coffee brewed on a timer. The lawn sprinklers ticked in measured arcs. A delivery truck hummed past the gates. But Daniel Whitmore had been awake since 4:17 a.m. He had stood at the window in his bedroom, staring out at the dark lawn where Lily had last been seen the day before. In the faint glow of security lights, the yard looked harmless, controlled, safe. It had looked that way yesterday, too. He rubbed a hand over his face and exhaled slowly. Across the hall, Lily's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. He paused there for a moment before heading downstairs. Inside, Lily slept curled around Rex, her favorite stuffed rabbit, blonde curls fanned across the pillow. Her breathing was steady. He watched her for longer than he meant to. There had been a time before the company went public, before the boardrooms and the pressure, and the relentless need to expand, when he used to sit like this every night, just watching her sleep, back when she was small enough to fit along his forearm. He stepped away quietly. In the kitchen, Maria was already there, as she had been for years, preparing breakfast. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the room. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. "Daniel," he corrected again, automatically, then paused. "Please." She looked at him carefully, uncertain whether to accept the familiarity. "Good morning, Daniel." He nodded once and poured himself coffee. "Did Annie sleep well?" he asked. Maria's expression softened. "She did. She told the story 3 times before bed." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. She earned that. Maria hesitated before speaking again. She has always believed in Daisy, even when others laugh. Daniel stirred his coffee slowly. "I won't laugh again," he said. The words were simple, but they were not light. Lily padded into the kitchen moments later, hair tangled, rubbing one eye. "Daddy?" He crouched instinctively as she ran into his arms. "Right here," he murmured. She clung to him longer than usual. Not frightened, just aware. "Can Annie come over after school?" she asked immediately. Daniel glanced at Maria. "If her mother agrees," he said carefully. Maria gave a small nod. "We will see." Later that morning, Daniel found himself canceling 2 meetings he would normally never move. His assistant sounded surprised. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes," he replied. "Everything is exactly as it should be." He meant it. By early afternoon, he drove himself to the office downtown, a sleek glass tower bearing his company's name. The lobby gleamed. Executives moved with purpose. Investors waited for assurances. Daniel delivered them smoothly, but halfway through a presentation on expansion into 3 new states, his gaze drifted to the city beyond the windows. Traffic pulsed. People crossed streets without security details, without private gates. Children walked home from school holding hands. He lost his place for half a second. "Daniel?" one board member prompted gently. He recovered immediately. Numbers resumed. Charts made sense again. Control restored. Yet something lingered. After the meeting, his longtime business partner, Robert Hale, caught up with him in the hallway. "Heard there was some excitement at your place yesterday," Robert said lightly. "Kids wander. It happens." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't excitement," he replied evenly. "It was a reminder." Robert chuckled. "Of what?" "That control is an illusion." Robert studied him more closely. "You don't usually talk like that." Daniel didn't respond. That evening, back at the estate, the air felt lighter. Lily had returned from school full of energy, eager to retell the story to anyone who would listen, and Daisy just pulled and pulled. She explained dramatically as Annie sat beside her on the living room rug. "And then she barked, like this woof, and Daddy ran faster than I've ever seen." Annie giggled. Maria sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in her lap. Daniel stood near the fireplace, watching the 2 girls. Daisy lay stretched between them, tail occasionally thumping when Lily's voice grew animated. "Daddy cried," Lily added bluntly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" "Yes," Lily insisted. "A little." Annie looked up at him thoughtfully. "It's okay," she said. "My mom says grown-ups who don't cry just forget how." Maria flushed slightly at being quoted. Daniel felt something warm and humbling settle over him again. "Your mom sounds wise," he said. "She is," Annie replied without hesitation. The afternoon sun painted the room in gold. Dust motes drifted lazily through the light. For the first time in years, Daniel did not feel the need to check his phone. He sat down on the floor beside the girls. Lily leaned into his side. Annie shifted slightly to make room. Daisy adjusted accordingly, as if this arrangement was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel looked at Annie. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" he asked. Annie considered the question seriously. "A veterinarian," she said. "So dogs don't hurt and nobody ignores them." Maria's eyes flickered with surprise. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's a good goal." Lily perked up. "I want to be a singer, but I won't walk away from the house." They all laughed softly. Daniel's gaze moved between the 2 girls, their different backgrounds, their identical laughter. For years, he had believed that providing was the same as protecting. Now he wasn't so sure. Later, as the sun dipped low, Maria stood. "We should go," she said gently. "Homework. Dinner." Daniel rose as well. "Stay," Lily protested. "You'll see each other tomorrow," Annie assured her. At the door, Daniel handed Maria a small envelope. She stiffened slightly. "Mr. Daniel, I told you." "It's not money," he said quickly. "It's information." She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a brochure for a local veterinary youth program fully sponsored. Maria looked up sharply. "For Annie," Daniel said. "If she wants it." Annie's eyes widened. Maria's throat tightened visibly. "You don't owe us," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze. "I'm not paying a debt," he replied. I'm investing in someone who showed me what loyalty looks like. Silence stretched between them. Then Maria nodded once. Thank you, she said. As Annie and Daisy stepped off the porch, Lily called out, See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, Annie echoed. Daniel watched them walk down the path again. The same small figures as yesterday, but now something fundamental had shifted. The estate gates stood tall and iron, but they no longer felt like walls. They felt like something that could open. 3 days passed without incident. Routine returned in quiet layers. Lily went to school each morning with her pink backpack and mismatched socks. Maria arrived at 7, sharp, apron folded neatly in her bag. Annie walked beside her mother, Daisy trotting close, the hound's heavy paws surprisingly graceful on the sidewalk. Daniel began noticing things he had not noticed before. The way Annie always checked both directions twice before crossing the street. The way Maria greeted the security guard by name. The way Daisy paused at the iron gates each morning, not hesitant, just aware. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He found Lily and Annie sprawled across the living room floor, working on a poster board for a school project. Glitter clung to their fingers. A half-open box of crayons lay between them. Daisy rested nearby, head on her paws, eyes tracking the girls lazily. What's the project? Daniel asked. Lily looked up brightly. Community helpers, Annie added. We're drawing police officers, doctors, and veterinarians. Daniel smiled faintly. That's ambitious. Lily held up a drawing. It was unmistakably Daisy, large, gray, with a heroic expression and an oversized badge drawn crookedly on her chest. She's a search dog, Lily explained proudly. Like the ones on TV, Annie studied her own drawing carefully. Her veterinarian wore simple scrubs and knelt beside a dog with a stitched ear. Daniel crouched beside them. You know, he said thoughtfully, community helpers don't always wear uniforms. Lily tilted her head. Who else? He looked at Annie. Sometimes, he said slowly. They wear sneakers and hold a leash. Annie's ears reddened slightly, but she didn't look away. Maria stood in the doorway, watching. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, Daniel received a call he had not expected. It was Officer Riley. Mr. Connett. Whitmore, Riley began, voice professional but measured. We've had 2 reports in neighboring districts this month. Young kids wandering off during public events. Nothing serious, but close calls. Daniel's stomach tightened. Patterns? He asked. Not exactly, Riley said. But we're increasing patrol presence. I thought you'd want to know. Daniel thanked him and hung up slowly. He stepped out onto the back patio, watching Lily chase Daisy across the grass while Annie timed them with exaggerated seriousness. The yard looked the same as it had before, but Daniel no longer saw safety as automatic. He saw vulnerability. Later that night, after Annie and Maria had gone home, Daniel sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He opened his laptop and pulled up local community safety reports. He didn't like what he saw. Nothing dramatic. No kidnappings. No headlines. Just small, almost dismissed incidents. Children separated from parents. A toddler found 2 blocks from home. A 7-year-old who followed a street performer too far. Close calls. Close calls add up, he thought. His phone buzzed. A text from Maria. Thank you again. Annie can't stop talking about the veterinary program. He stared at the message for a long moment before replying. She earned it. He hesitated, then added, so did Daisy. Across town, in a modest duplex apartment not far from the trailer park where they had once lived, Annie brushed Daisy's thick coat with careful strokes. See? She whispered to the dog. I told you he'd listen. Daisy huffed softly. Maria watched from the doorway, folding laundry. You were brave, she said quietly. Annie shook her head. I wasn't brave, she replied. I just knew. Maria crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter. Knowing can be brave, she said. Annie thought about that. Do you think bad things happen a lot? She asked suddenly. Maria's hands paused. Sometimes, she admitted carefully. But not because the world is only bad. Sometimes it's because people stop paying attention. Annie nodded, processing. Back at the estate, Daniel stood again at Lily's bedroom door before turning in for the night. She slept on her stomach, one arm flung over Rex. The soft glow of her nightlight cast warm shadows along the walls. He stepped inside quietly and adjusted her blanket. As he did, she stirred slightly. "Daddy?" she murmured. "I'm here," he whispered. She relaxed instantly. The words lingered in the air. "I'm here." He wondered how many parents had whispered that same phrase only to realize they hadn't been. The next morning, Daniel made an unusual call. He requested a meeting with the city council regarding public event safety measures. Not as a billionaire sponsor, as a father. When he arrived at the office later that day, Robert noticed the stack of printed reports under his arm. "What's this?" Robert asked. "Community risk assessment," Daniel replied. Robert frowned. "We're in real estate, Daniel. Not law enforcement." Daniel looked at him steadily. "We're in communities," he said. There was a difference. That afternoon, Lily's school sent home permission slips for an upcoming fall fair. Lily ran to Daniel with the paper. "Can we go?" she asked eagerly. He took the form slowly. "Yes," he said after a moment. "We'll go," she grinned. "Together?" He met her eyes. "Together." Across town, Annie taped her completed Community Helpers poster to the wall above her small desk. Daisy sat beside her, watching with solemn approval. Annie traced the crayon badge she had drawn on the dog. "You think you'll have to find someone else someday?" she asked quietly. Daisy didn't answer, of course, but her ears twitched, and somewhere deep in the quiet corners of the city, unseen risks continued to move in ways most people never noticed. Daniel Whitmore had built a life believing danger was something you could calculate. He was beginning to understand that the most dangerous things were often the ones that slipped past unnoticed until someone paid attention. The city council meeting room smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. Daniel Whitmore had not sat in a space like this in years, fluorescent lights humming overhead, metal folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a faded American flag standing in the corner beside a bulletin board covered in outdated flyers for blood drives and neighborhood watch meetings. He took a seat in the second row, not at the front, not at the back, just among the other residents. A retired couple whispered to each other nearby. A mother bounced a toddler on her knee. A man in a construction jacket scrolled through his phone. No one paid much attention to Daniel at first. That changed when someone recognized him. A murmur traveled quietly through the room. Daniel kept his posture relaxed. No suit jacket tonight. Just a navy sweater and pressed slacks. Deliberately unremarkable. When his turn came to speak, he stood without notes. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he began calmly. "I live on Ashford Lane." A few eyebrows lifted. "I'm here as a father." The room grew quieter. "Last weekend, my daughter followed the sound of music from a community festival and wandered farther than she should have. She was found quickly, thanks to a neighbor's dog and a child who paid closer attention than I did." A small ripple of understanding moved through the room. "I'm not here to assign blame," Daniel continued. "I'm here to suggest that when we plan public events, we consider clearer, child-safe perimeters, better signage, volunteer watch points, not because we expect danger but because we respect the possibility." One of the council members, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Henderson, leaned forward. "You're proposing additional funding?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "I'm proposing partnership. My company can sponsor upgraded safety materials and additional temporary lighting for larger events, but I'd prefer it not carry my name." A few surprised glances circled the room. "Why not?" someone asked from the back. Daniel paused. "Because safety shouldn't feel like a donation," he said evenly. "It should feel like responsibility." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "We'll review your proposal." After the meeting, several parents approached him quietly. "Thank you," one mother said. "It's easy to think it won't happen to us." Daniel met her gaze. "It almost did," he replied. Later that evening, he drove home with the windows cracked open, cool autumn air filling the car. The city looked different tonight, not threatening, not fragile, just layered, complex. He thought about Annie kneeling in the middle of a crowd, whispering to Daisy, about how easily he had dismissed her certainty. He thought about the phrase she had said days ago, "Sometimes grown-ups get more scared than kids do." He had built an empire on anticipating fear, but children, he realized, lived on trust. At the estate, he found Lily and Annie in the backyard again. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long amber light across the lawn. Daisy was running short, controlled sprints while Annie called out directions like a tiny coach. Left. Good. Sit. Daisy obeyed instantly, muscles coiled and precise. Lily clapped enthusiastically. She's so smart. Daniel leaned against the patio railing. Training? He asked lightly. Annie glanced over. Practice, she corrected. She likes to work. Daniel walked closer. Can she track without a bracelet? He asked. Annie nodded thoughtfully. If she smelled something enough times. Lily brightened. Like my backpack. Daniel exchanged a look with Maria, who stood nearby folding towels. Let's not test that, he said gently. They all laughed. As the evening deepened, the girls settled on the grass. Daisy stretched between them. Fireflies blinked faintly near the hedge line. Daniel lowered himself onto the patio step. Annie, he said after a moment, have you ever thought about training Daisy formally? Search and rescue? Annie's eyes widened. Like real missions? Yes. Maria stiffened slightly at that word. Daniel noticed. It wouldn't mean danger, he clarified. It would mean structure, certification, community service. Annie looked down at Daisy, stroking her ear. Would she still be mine? She asked quietly. The question was simple, but it carried more than ownership. Daniel understood that. Yes, he said firmly. Always yours. Annie nodded slowly. I'll think about it. The wind shifted slightly, cooler now. Across the hedge line, a car drove slowly down the street before continuing on. Daniel's eyes tracked it automatically. He didn't miss things as easily anymore. Later that night, after Annie and Maria had gone home, Daniel sat at the kitchen table reviewing blueprints not for buildings this time, but for temporary event layouts, barrier placements, sightline angles, volunteer check-in stations. Lily wandered in, sleepy. What are you building? She asked, climbing into his lap. Safer festivals, he said. She considered that seriously. Can Annie come to the next one? Yes, he replied. Together, she rested her head against his chest. Daddy, yes? If Daisy hadn't found me, would you have? He swallowed. Yes, he said quietly. I would have. But in the silence that followed, he admitted to himself that the answer had not been as certain 3 days ago. After Lily went to bed, Daniel stepped outside one last time. The lawn lay still under the moonlight. Security lights glowed softly along the perimeter. The world appeared calm, but Daniel knew now that calm was not the same as safe. Across town, Annie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Mom? Yes. Do you think Mr. Whitmore trusts us now? Maria thought for a moment. I think he's learning, she said. Annie smiled faintly in the dark. Daisy shifted at the foot of the bed, releasing a low, contented sigh. Somewhere in the city, distant sirens wailed briefly and faded. Life moved, risks moved, but so did people who paid attention. Daniel Whitmore had started something with a council meeting and a promise. He did not yet know that attention, once awakened, would reveal more than wandering children and misplaced trust. Sometimes, when you begin looking for danger, you also begin uncovering truth. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. It was Saturday morning, clear and cool, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the sky look sharper than usual. The Whitmore estate lawn shimmered with dew, and fallen leaves gathered along the edge of the driveway like small amber warnings. Daniel was in the backyard with Lily and Annie. They had decided to practice tracking games, as Lily called them. It had started as a joke. Daniel had hidden one of Lily's scarves behind the oak tree, while Annie held Daisy back by the collar. Ready? Annie asked. Daisy's muscles trembled with anticipation. Go. The hound shot forward, nose low, weaving past garden stones and trimmed hedges with controlled intensity. Within seconds, she barked once at the base of the oak. Lily cheered. Daniel smiled, but his eyes were elsewhere. Beyond the hedgerow that bordered the estate, a dark sedan idled briefly at the curb. Not unusual. People slowed down near large properties all the time, but this car did not simply slow. It stopped. The engine hummed. Daniel's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Again! Lily cried, already running toward the tree. Daniel stepped casually toward the hedge, as if stretching his legs. The sedan's windows were tinted. The front windshield caught the morning light, hiding whoever sat inside. He memorized the license plate automatically. Then, as if aware of being observed, the car rolled forward and disappeared down the street. Daniel remained still for a moment longer than necessary. "Daddy?" Lily called. He turned, smile already restored. "Coming." He said nothing, but he filed it away. Later that afternoon, Annie and Maria stayed for lunch. Daniel had insisted. The dining room felt less formal now. Lily had convinced everyone to sit at the smaller breakfast table, instead of the long, polished oak one that could seat 12. Daisy lay beneath the table, occasionally thumping her tail when crumbs fell. They ate grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and warm rolls. Simple, comfortable. Conversation drifted easily until Maria paused mid-sentence. "Annie," she said quietly, "did you leave Daisy outside alone yesterday afternoon?" Annie frowned. "No," Maria hesitated. "The neighbor mentioned seeing someone near the fence." Daniel's fork stilled. "What neighbor?" he asked calmly. "Mrs. Klein," Maria replied. She said a man walked past slowly. She thought he was looking for an address. Daniel's jaw tightened subtly. "Did Daisy react?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "She didn't bark," Maria added. But she was restless that evening. Daniel leaned back in his chair, expression thoughtful, restless. Daisy did not bark unnecessarily. She did not startle easily. "Annie," he said gently, "if Daisy senses something unusual, I want you to tell me. Immediately." Annie nodded. "I will." That night, Daniel reviewed the security footage from the exterior cameras. At 3:14 p.m., a man in a gray hoodie had walked along the outer sidewalk. He had paused near the hedge, glanced toward the house, then continued on. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, but something about the way he had paused lingered. Daniel zoomed in. The image blurred when the man lowered his head slightly, obscuring his face. Deliberate. Daniel replayed the clip 3 times. Then he sent it quietly to Mark. "Keep an eye out," he texted. Across town, Annie was brushing Daisy again before bed. "You felt something," she murmured softly into the dog's ear. Daisy's tail flicked once. Annie frowned thoughtfully. The next morning, Sunday. The fall fair at Lily's school began at 10. This time, Daniel arrived early. He walked the perimeter himself. Temporary fences had been installed at his suggestion. Volunteer parents wore bright orange badges reading Child Watch. Signs marked clearly designated exits. He felt a measured satisfaction. Progress. Lily and Annie ran ahead toward the craft booths, Daisy on a leash between them. Parents greeted Daniel more warmly than before. Word of his sponsorship had spread, even without official publicity. Officer Riley stood near the entrance. "Looks good," Riley said, nodding toward the improved layout. "It's a start," Daniel replied. As the fair grew busier, Daniel noticed something else. The same dark sedan from the previous day, parked across the street, windows tinted, engine off. His pulse slowed, not quickened. Fear would not help. Observation would. He subtly shifted position, keeping the vehicle in view without drawing attention. "Mark," he murmured into his phone. "I see it," Mark replied immediately. Running plates now. Minutes passed. The sedan remained still. Inside the fairgrounds, children laughed. Cotton candy machines whirred. Music drifted from the stage. Annie and Lily stood at the face-painting booth. Daisy lay at their feet, alert, but calm. Then Daisy's ears lifted. Her body stiffened, not aggressively, but sharply. She stood, nose turning toward the street. Annie felt the change instantly. She followed Daisy's gaze. Across the street, the sedan's driver's side door cracked open slightly, just enough to reveal a shape shifting inside. Daniel's entire focus narrowed. "Stay here," he told Mark quietly, already stepping forward. But before he could move farther, Daisy let out a deep, warning bark. Not the triumphant bark of finding someone. Not playful. A barrier. Heads turned. The man inside the sedan hesitated. Daisy barked again louder. Annie tightened her grip on the leash. "Daisy," she said firmly, not panicked, just anchoring. The car door shut abruptly. The engine roared to life, and the sedan pulled away fast. Too fast for coincidence. Silence hung in the air for half a second before the fair's normal sounds resumed. Most people hadn't even noticed. Daniel had. Officer Riley had. Mark had. Daniel walked calmly back toward Annie and Lily. "You did good," he said quietly to Annie. Annie looked up at him, eyes serious. "She didn't like him," she said simply. Daniel nodded. "I didn't either." Lily tugged on his sleeve, oblivious. Can we get caramel apples? He forced a gentle smile. Yes, he said. We can. But as he stood in line for apples, his mind was elsewhere. This was no wandering child, no coincidence. Someone had been watching, and Daisy had noticed first. Again, that evening, as the sun sank low and the estate lights flickered on, Daniel stood alone by the hedge, where the sedan had paused 2 days before. The world felt peaceful, too peaceful. He no longer saw risk as abstract. It had shape now. Movement. Intention. He thought of Annie's quiet certainty, of Daisy's unwavering instinct. Loyalty is protection, Annie had once implied, without saying it. Daniel inhaled slowly. Whoever had been watching had just learned something important. The Whitmore estate was not unguarded, and it was not alone. Daniel did not sleep well that night. Not because he was panicked, because he was thinking. There was a difference. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in his mind. The sedan parked too long, the door cracking open, Daisy's bark low, unmistakably warning. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been curiosity. It had been calculation. By morning, Daniel had already made 3 decisions. First, he would not alert Lily. Second, he would not overreact publicly. Third, he would find out who had been watching. At breakfast, the house felt ordinary again. Lily chattered about the fair. Annie described the face paint design. She'd chosen a small blue paw print on her wrist that had nearly faded by now. Daisy lay near the patio doors, unusually alert for that early in the day. Daniel watched her closely. Did she sleep? He asked Annie. Annie nodded. But she got up once. She stood by the window. Maria looked concerned. She does that when she senses something off. Daniel stirred his coffee. Good, he said quietly. Let her. Later that morning, Daniel met Mark in his study. The security chief stood beside the large monitor displaying still frames from various cameras. License plate? Daniel asked. Stolen, Mark replied. Reported missing 2 weeks ago. Daniel exhaled through his nose slowly. Facial recognition? Partial, Mark said. We enhanced the footage. Cross-referencing now. Daniel leaned forward. I don't want this to turn into rumor, he said. No chatter, no leaks. Understood. Mark hesitated. You think it's connected to the fair? Daniel didn't answer immediately. I think someone was testing proximity, he said finally. Testing, not striking. Yet, that afternoon, Daniel drove himself to Annie and Maria's duplex. He did not announce his arrival. He parked across the street and observed. The neighborhood was modest but active. Kids rode bikes. A mail carrier waved casually at passing cars. A dog barked from a nearby yard. Normal. He stepped out of the car and approached the small front porch. Maria opened the door before he knocked. Her eyes widened slightly. Is everything okay? Yes, Daniel said calmly. May I come in? She stepped aside. Inside, Annie sat cross-legged on the floor with Daisy, assembling a small cardboard box into what looked like a pretend vet clinic. Daisy tolerated the toy stethoscope with patient dignity. Annie looked up and smiled. Hi, Mr. Whitmore. Daniel crouched to her level. Hi, Annie. He glanced at Daisy. Has she been uneasy today? Annie shook her head slowly. She's normal now. Daniel nodded. Good. Maria folded her arms gently, sensing the weight beneath his questions. What happened? She asked quietly. Daniel chose his words carefully. Someone has been watching the house and the fair. Maria's face drained of color. Watching Lily? Possibly, Daniel replied evenly. Or testing security. Annie's small hands tightened in Daisy's fur. Daisy's ears flicked at the subtle change in Annie's breathing. Maria's voice lowered. Do we need to leave? Daniel met her gaze firmly. No. The word was steady. Running only confirms fear, he said. We don't confirm fear. Maria nodded slowly, though tension lingered in her shoulders. Annie spoke up quietly. Daisy will know if he comes close again. Daniel believed her. That unsettled him, but it also steadied him. I'm increasing patrols, he said, discreetly. And I'd like to install additional cameras here. Maria hesitated. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Daniel said gently. It's community. Annie looked between them. Bad people don't like dogs, she said matter-of-factly. Daniel's lips curved slightly. No, he agreed. They don't. That evening, As dusk settled over the duplex neighborhood, Daisy sat unusually upright near the window, not restless, just alert. Daniel had insisted on staying until dark. He stood in the small kitchen, phone in hand, reviewing enhanced still images Mark had just sent. The suspect's face was partially visible now, mid-30s. Sharp yaw, neutral expression, not homeless, not erratic, deliberate. Daniel forwarded the image to Officer Riley. Across the room, Daisy stood suddenly. Her posture changed, head up, ears forward. Annie froze. "He's here," she whispered. Daniel's heart did not race, it narrowed. He moved toward the window carefully and shifted the curtain aside just enough to see. Across the street, the same sedan, parked, engine running. The driver remained inside. Watching, Daniel stepped back. "Stay inside," he murmured. Annie did not argue. Maria's breathing grew shallow. Daisy's low growl vibrated through the small living room. Not loud, not wild, just a warning. Daniel dialed calmly. "Riley," he said. "We have him." Outside, the sedan idled. The driver's head tilted slightly as if listening. Then Daisy barked. Not once, not twice. 3 sharp, unmistakable alarms. The sedan's brake lights flared. Tires squealed. The car sped away. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, Riley's patrol already circling the area. Silence followed. Maria exhaled shakily. Annie knelt beside Daisy and wrapped both arms around her thick neck. "You did it again," she whispered. Daniel stared at the empty stretch of road. He understood something now with clarity. This wasn't random curiosity. It wasn't coincidence. Someone had taken interest in Lily, or in him, and Daisy had drawn a line. Daniel turned back toward Annie. "From now on," he said quietly, "we stay together." Annie nodded. "Together," she repeated. Outside, patrol lights flickered briefly at the corner before fading. The neighborhood resumed its normal rhythm, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The threat had moved from distant possibility to visible shape, and the line between wealth and vulnerability had never felt thinner. Daniel Whitmore had built walls to protect what he loved. Now he understood something deeper. Walls could be watched, but loyalty could not be intimidated. And somewhere out there, the man in the sedan had just learned the same lesson. By Monday morning, the situation had shifted from suspicion to investigation. Daniel stood in his study again, the large screen displaying a clearer still image of the man in the sedan. Officer Riley had come in person this time. "We've got a partial ID," Riley said, arms folded. "Name's Victor Hale, 36. No violent record. A few fraud charges 5 years ago. Nothing recent." "Hale," Daniel repeated. The name felt uncomfortably familiar. "Any connection to me?" he asked. Riley hesitated. "We're still digging, but he's been in the vicinity of 3 high-profile neighborhoods this month." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Scouting, that's one word for it," Riley replied. Mark stood near the doorway, silent but attentive. "Surveillance?" Daniel asked. "We're monitoring," Riley said. "But unless he crosses a line, we can't detain him." Daniel understood the law. He respected it, but he did not underestimate patience. "Then we make sure he knows he's visible," Daniel said evenly. That afternoon, Daniel increased visible security at the estate, not aggressively, not theatrically. Subtle adjustments, patrol rotation shifts, camera repositioning, better lighting along the outer hedge. Not walls. Awareness. At school, Lily and Annie remained blissfully unaware. They sat side by side in the cafeteria, trading apple slices and whispering about an upcoming spelling test. Daisy, now certified as a therapy support dog for school events thanks to Daniel's quiet sponsorship, lay near the entrance during dismissal hours. Parents had grown accustomed to her presence. Children waved as they passed. Officer Riley had recommended it. "Visible protection deters quiet predators," he had said. That afternoon, as school let out, Annie felt Daisy's body tense before she saw anything. The dog's ears pricked sharply. Annie turned toward the parking lot. Across the street, a familiar sedan, not parked this time, circling slowly. Annie's pulse quickened, but she did not panic. She knelt beside Daisy. "It's him," she whispered. Daisy's low rumble vibrated through her chest. Inside the school gate, Daniel stood speaking with the principal. He noticed Annie's posture immediately. He followed her line of sight. The sedan passed once, twice, then slowed. Daniel stepped forward. positioning himself naturally between the gate and the street. His voice remained calm. "Inside," he told Lily gently. "Both of you." Lily frowned. "Why?" "Because I said so," he answered, not harsh, but firm. The tone was new. Lily obeyed. Annie guided Daisy backward toward the entrance doors. The sedan idled longer this time. Too long. Mark's voice crackled through Daniel's earpiece. "Police inbound." Daisy barked again. The sedan accelerated, but this time, it didn't get far. 2 patrol cars appeared from opposite directions, boxing it in at the intersection. The driver attempted a turn. Too late. Riley stepped out of his cruiser, hand resting near his holster not drawn. Victor Hale exited the sedan slowly, hands raised just enough to show compliance. Daniel watched from the school gate. No fear, only clarity. Victor's gaze flicked briefly toward him, then toward the school building, then toward Daisy. The hound stood rigid, silent now, but fully alert. Victor's expression shifted subtle irritation, recognition. He knew he had been identified. Riley approached Daniel minutes later. "We'll bring him in for questioning," he said. "Suspicious behavior near a school gives us room." Daniel nodded. "What was he looking for?" Lily asked quietly beside him. Daniel crouched. "Nothing he's going to find," he said. That evening, the city buzzed quietly with rumor. High-profile businessman, school surveillance, arrest. Daniel avoided the press. He remained focused. At the station, Victor Hale sat across from Officer Riley under fluorescent light. "Just driving," Victor insisted. "Public roads." "You've been near 3 specific neighborhoods," Riley replied calmly. 2 parks, 1 private estate, now a school. Victor shrugged. "Nice areas." Riley slid a photograph across the table. Daisy's image, captured clearly during one of the fair days. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "A dog," he muttered. "Yes," Riley said. "A dog." Back at the estate, Daniel sat on the patio while Lily and Annie built a small cardboard clinic for Daisy under the oak tree. The air felt different now, tighter, but steadier. Maria approached Daniel quietly. "Will he come back?" she asked. Daniel stared at the horizon for a long moment. "Not like this," he said. Annie walked over, Daisy beside her. "Is he bad?" she asked directly. Daniel considered the question carefully. "He made bad choices," he replied. "That's different." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "Daisy doesn't like him," she said simply. Daniel glanced at the hound. "I trust her judgment." Night fell without incident. Security lights glowed softly along the perimeter. Daniel stood at Lily's door once more before bed. She looked up from her pillow. "Is the scary man gone?" Daniel sat beside her. "He's being questioned," he said honestly. "And we're safe." She studied his face. "You promise?" He placed a hand over hers. "I promise I will never stop paying attention." Across town, Annie lay in bed with Daisy curled near her feet. "You're braver than him," she whispered to the dog. Daisy's tail thumped once. At the police station, Victor Hale remained silent under questioning. He had not crossed the line far enough. Not yet. But Daniel Whitmore understood something clearly now. Predators test boundaries. They probe for weakness, and they retreat when confronted with loyalty that does not break. The line had been drawn, not by walls, not by wealth, but by a dog who refused to look away. Victor Hale did not confess. He did not threaten. He did not explain. After 12 hours of questioning and no concrete charge that would hold beyond suspicious conduct, he walked out of the station with a lawyer at his side and a calm expression that unsettled Daniel more than anger would have. "He knows the lines," Officer Riley said quietly that evening. "He hasn't crossed one we can prove." Daniel stood beside his car in the station parking lot, hands in his coat pockets. "He was testing reaction time," Daniel replied. Riley nodded once, and he got it. Back at the estate, the night felt heavier than usual, not chaotic, not loud, just aware. Daniel had doubled patrols for the week. Mark had adjusted camera sensitivity along the outer fence. The security team rotated quietly, professionally. Inside, Lily and Annie were in the living room, finishing homework together while Daisy lay stretched between them like a silent guardian. Lily looked up. "Is he in jail?" she asked. Daniel paused. "No," he said honestly. "But he knows we're watching." Annie glanced at Daisy. "He won't like that." Daniel's gaze softened. "No," he agreed. "He won't." Maria stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. "We can stay home this week." she offered gently. No school events, no public outings. Daniel considered it. Fear tightens space, he thought. No, he said calmly. We live normally. We just live alert. Maria studied him carefully. She nodded. Later that night, as the girls slept Lily upstairs in her room, Annie staying over at Lily's insistence, Daniel sat alone in the dim light of his study. He replayed Victor Hale's face in his mind. Not unstable, not desperate, intentional. There was motive here, and Daniel did not believe it was random. He opened his laptop and searched deeper. Victor Hale. Fraud charges. Small-time investment schemes targeting wealthy retirees. No violence. No prior restraining orders. No public threats. Then one detail surfaced. 3 years ago, Hale had attempted to sue a real estate development company for breach of contract. The case had been dismissed. Daniel leaned closer. The company name caught his eye. Whitmore Development. The case had been minor. One of dozens filed and dismissed during a contentious acquisition period. Daniel did not remember it personally, but Victor Hale might. The realization settled slowly. This was not about Lily. It was about proximity, power, resentment. Someone who believed he had been overlooked or wronged. Daniel closed the laptop. Across the hall, Daisy lifted her head from the rug outside Lily's bedroom door. She had chosen that position herself. Annie lay asleep beside Lily on the bed, one arm thrown loosely over her friend. Two small silhouettes under a quilt patterned with stars. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment. They looked peaceful, untouched. He would keep it that way. The next morning, he met with his legal team. I want a full review of every dismissed claim filed by Victor Hale, he said. His attorney adjusted her glasses. You think this is retaliation? I think it's obsession, Daniel replied evenly. Do you want to pursue a restraining order? Daniel considered it carefully. Not yet, he said. We need grounds that hold. He was patient. He could afford patience, but Victor Hale might not. That afternoon, Daisy's behavior shifted again. Annie noticed first. The dog paced near the front windows, not barking, not growling, just watching. He's close, Annie said quietly. Daniel moved to the security monitor. Nothing visible on camera, but Daisy did not move from the window. 10 minutes later, Mark's voice crackled through the intercom. Black SUV 2 blocks south. Parked. Engine off. Daniel's jaw tightened. Plate? Different vehicle. Same driver. Victor was escalating. Testing response again. This time, Daniel did not wait for police to intercept. He stepped outside. Not recklessly. Not alone, Mark remained within distance, but visible. He stood at the edge of the driveway, posture relaxed, hands at his sides. Across the distant block, the SUV's engine started. Victor stepped out briefly. Their eyes met, not through tinted glass, directly. Victor's expression held something colder than anger. Frustration. Daniel did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply held the gaze. Behind him, Daisy appeared at the gate, silent but alert. Victor noticed. His gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Daniel. The message was unspoken but clear. You're not alone. Victor got back into the SUV and drove away. No squealing tires this time. No panic. Just calculation. Inside the house, Annie looked up at Daniel. He doesn't like losing, she said softly. Daniel almost smiled. Neither do I. Maria crossed her arms protectively. Will this end? She asked. Daniel met her eyes. Yes, he said with certainty, because now the situation had clarity. Victor Hale had a motive. He had pride. And pride, when confronted, either retreats or makes a mistake. Daniel returned to his study and made one more call. To the DA's office. He instructed his assistant. I'd like to discuss harassment statutes. That night, as the estate lights glowed and the security team maintained quiet watch, Daisy lay once more outside Lily's door. Annie stirred slightly in her sleep. In the stillness, Daniel realized something profound. Protection was not about eliminating risk. It was about refusing to surrender to it. Victor Hale had chosen the wrong family to intimidate, because this family was not guarded only by wealth. It was guarded by loyalty, and loyalty does not blink. The mistake came 4 days later. Victor Hale did not approach the estate. He did not circle the school. He chose something smaller, subtler. On Thursday afternoon, Annie and Lily were in the backyard again, sitting cross-legged beneath the oak tree with Daisy stretched between them. They were working on a new poster, this one for the upcoming Fall Family Festival at school. Daniel had helped fund additional safety measures again, quietly. Maria was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Daniel stood in the study reviewing documents from the district attorney's office regarding harassment thresholds. It was calm, routine. Then Daisy's head snapped up. No bark, just stillness. Annie froze instantly. "Don't move," she whispered to Lily. Lily blinked. "Why?" Daisy stood slowly and began walking toward the side hedge, not aggressively, not lunging, just deliberate. Annie followed. From the hedge line, barely visible between the trimmed branches, a small object lay on the grass. A phone. Not theirs. Lily leaned closer. "Is that yours?" Annie shook her head slowly. Daisy did not touch it. She circled once, nostrils flaring. Then she growled. "Low. Deep." Daniel heard it from inside. He moved quickly but calmly onto the patio. "What is it?" he asked. Annie pointed. Daniel approached carefully. The phone lay face up, screen dark. He did not pick it up. Instead, he stepped back. "Mark," he said into his earpiece. "We have something at the hedge." Within seconds, security moved in. Mark crouched carefully and examined the device. "Recording app active," he said quietly. "Still running." Daniel's expression hardened. Victor had escalated. He wasn't just watching now. He was documenting. Testing reaction time. Testing blind spots. "Shut it down," Daniel instructed. Mark powered the device off and placed it in an evidence bag. Lily looked confused. Why would someone leave a phone? Daniel knelt in front of her. Because sometimes people try to see what they're not invited to see. Annie's face was serious. He thought Daisy wouldn't notice. Daniel met her eyes. He was wrong. Within the hour, Officer Riley stood at the hedge line. "Now we've got probable cause," Riley said quietly. "Placing recording equipment on private property crosses the line." Daniel nodded once. "Will you pick him up?" "We already are." Across town, Victor Hale sat in his SUV reviewing footage on a second device. He never saw the patrol car until the lights flashed behind him. By sunset, Victor was back in interrogation, this time not calm, not detached. "You can't prove intent," he snapped. Riley slid the evidence bag across the table. "Recording minors on private property without consent," Riley replied. "We don't need to prove intent. We prove action." Victor's jaw tightened. "It was curiosity," he muttered. "Curiosity doesn't hide phones in hedges," Riley said evenly. At the estate, Daniel stood beside Annie under the oak tree. "You were the first to see Daisy react," he said quietly. Annie shrugged. "She always tells the truth." Daniel glanced at the hedge. He thought he could outweigh us. Annie looked up at him thoughtfully. "Bad people don't like being seen," she said. Daniel almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "They don't." That evening, Maria hugged Annie tightly before bed. "You trusted your dog," she whispered. Annie hugged her back. "She trusted me too." In the study, Daniel reviewed the official notice. Charges filed for unlawful surveillance and trespassing. Not severe, but enough. Victor Hale would not walk out this time without conditions. As the house settled into quiet, Daniel stood once more at Lily's bedroom door. She slept peacefully. Daisy lay outside the door again on her own, unprompted. Daniel crouched beside the dog. "You saw it before we did," he murmured. Daisy's tail thumped once. In the distance, sirens wailed faintly, then faded. This time, the escalation had ended not with fear but with proof. Victor Hale had crossed the line, and the line had held. Daniel stood slowly and turned off the hallway light. Protection was no longer reactive. It was active, visible, shared. He understood now that vigilance was not paranoia. It was love in motion. Victor Hale did not look defiant this time. When Daniel saw him in court 3 days later, seated at the defense table in a wrinkled gray suit, there was no smugness left in his expression. No detached curiosity, only irritation and something else. Exposure. The courtroom was modest. The walls paneled in old wood, the American flag standing behind the judge's bench. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Daniel sat quietly in the back row, not in a power suit, not surrounded by attorneys, just present. Officer Riley stood near the aisle, hands folded behind his back. The charges were read clearly: unlawful surveillance, trespassing, harassment through persistent proximity. Victor's lawyer attempted to minimize. "My client never approached the child, never spoke to her. No threats were made." The judge adjusted her glasses and looked over the file. Intent is established through repeated action, she said evenly. And action has consequence. Victor's eyes flicked toward Daniel. For a brief second, resentment flashed again. Daniel held the gaze calmly. No anger, no challenge, just certainty. The court ordered a restraining order 100 yards from the Whitmore residence, the school, and any known associated addresses. Electronic monitoring pending further review. Mandatory evaluation, not prison, but boundary. After the hearing, as people filtered out, Victor spoke for the first time directly to Daniel. "You think you're untouchable," he muttered under his breath. Daniel stopped walking. "No," he said evenly. "I think my daughter is." Victor's jaw tightened. "You cost me everything," he said. Daniel's expression did not change. "You tried to take something from me first." Victor was escorted away before he could respond. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. Riley approached Daniel. "It'll hold," he said. "He's on record now." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you." That afternoon, life resumed. Lily and Annie were in the backyard again, this time with a small plastic stethoscope and a stuffed dog that had become Daisy's official patient. Daisy lay beside them, chin resting on her paws, eyes half closed but ears always alert. Maria sat on the patio with a cup of coffee Daniel had insisted on brewing for her himself. "You didn't have to come to court," she said quietly. Daniel looked toward the girls. "Yes," he replied. "I did." Maria followed his gaze. "He won't come back?" Daniel inhaled slowly. "Not without consequences he can't afford." Annie walked over, Daisy trailing behind. "Is he gone?" she asked. Daniel crouched. "He's not allowed near us anymore." Annie studied his face carefully. "Does that mean he's not bad anymore?" Daniel paused. "That means he has a chance to choose better." Annie nodded, satisfied enough. That evening, Daniel made another decision. He requested a community meeting at the school auditorium, not about Victor Hale specifically, but about vigilance, about shared responsibility. When he stood at the podium a week later, the room was filled with parents, teachers, and neighbors. He did not speak as a billionaire. He spoke as a father. "Danger doesn't always look dramatic," he said calmly. "Sometimes it looks like someone lingering too long, watching too quietly, testing how much we ignore." Parents shifted uncomfortably. "But fear is not the solution," Daniel continued. "Attention is." He gestured gently toward Annie and Daisy, seated in the front row beside Lily. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room notices first. A quiet ripple of recognition moved through the audience. He did not mention race. He did not mention wealth. He did not need to. Everyone understood what had happened. After the meeting, several parents approached Annie. "Your dog's incredible," one woman said warmly. Annie smiled shyly. "She just pays attention." Daisy wagged once. Later that night, the estate felt lighter than it had in weeks. Security remained. Cameras remained. But the tension had eased. Lily and Annie lay on the grass, staring up at the stars. "Do you think Daisy knows she's famous?" Lily whispered. Annie giggled. "She doesn't care." Daniel sat on the patio steps beside Maria. "You were right to bring her to the church that night," he said quietly, referencing the moment months ago when Annie had first insisted Daisy could find Lily. Maria smiled faintly. "She didn't ask permission." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Inside, the house glowed warmly. Outside, the hedges stood still. Victor Hale would face hearings, evaluations, legal consequences. But Daniel understood something deeper now. Protection was not an event. It was a posture. It was paying attention when others dismissed. It was listening to a child. It was trusting a dog. As the night deepened, Daisy stood and walked slowly toward the hedge line one last time before settling near Lily's feet. Not restless, not anxious, just aware. Daniel watched her. "You kept your promise," he murmured quietly. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time since the sedan first appeared, the world felt steady again. Not because danger had vanished, but because loyalty had answered it. Winter came quietly that year, not with violent storms or headlines, but with a slow whitening of lawns and the soft hush that settles over neighborhoods when frost touches rooftops before dawn. The Whitmore estate looked different under snow, less imposing, more human. Inside, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Maria had insisted on hosting a small Thanksgiving dinner, nothing extravagant, nothing that required staff to hover. Just warmth, just gratitude. Annie and Lily were at the dining table, carefully folding paper place cards. Daisy lay beneath the table, chin resting on her paws, eyes tracking every falling scrap of paper as if it were a classified operation. Daniel stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, carving turkey himself. He had not done that in years. "Dad," Lily said thoughtfully, "can Annie sit next to me?" Daniel looked up. "I think that can be arranged." Maria caught his eye and smiled. It was subtle, but it mattered. Annie sat straighter in her chair than usual, hands folded in her lap as if she were afraid to disturb something fragile. "You don't have to sit like that," Lily whispered. "You're not in trouble." Annie smiled faintly. "I know. I just don't want to mess anything up." Maria heard it. She leaned gently across the table. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you didn't come here to be perfect. You came because you're family." The word lingered. Family. Daniel did not interrupt it. He let it land. Across the table, Daisy thumped her tail once as if approving the declaration. Later, after plates were cleared and pie was half finished, the girls slipped outside into the early evening snow. Daisy bounded ahead, heavy paws leaving confident impressions behind her. Lily laughed. Annie followed. They built a small snowman near the oak tree, the same oak tree where everything had changed months ago. Daniel watched from the patio doors. "You're thinking again," Maria said quietly behind him. "I am." "About him?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "About what almost happened." Maria stepped beside him. "And what didn't?" He nodded. Victor Hale's case had progressed without drama. Mandatory therapy. Continued monitoring. No contact violations. Daniel had chosen not to follow the details too closely anymore. He had learned something important about control. You cannot control the world. You can only decide who you become in response to it. The girl's laughter carried through the glass. Daisy suddenly paused, ears pricked, not in alarm, just awareness. Annie crouched and whispered something to her. Daniel watched the exchange. Trust was a language, and Daisy spoke it fluently. That night, after Maria and Annie had gone home, Lily sat on the living room rug beside Daisy. "Dad?" "Yes." "Are we safe now?" Daniel walked over and sat across from her. "We were always working to be safe," he said gently. "That's not the same," Lily replied. He smiled faintly. "No, it isn't." He reached out and brushed a curl away from her forehead. "Safety doesn't mean nothing bad ever tries to happen," he said. "It means when it does, people stand up." Lily considered that. "Like Annie?" "Yes." "And Daisy?" "Yes." "And you?" Daniel paused. "Like all of us." Lily leaned forward and hugged Daisy's neck. Daisy leaned back into her without hesitation. Later that evening, Daniel stepped outside alone. Snow fell lightly now. The estate lights reflected softly against the white lawn. He walked toward the hedge line where the phone had once been hidden. There was no sign of disturbance now, just quiet. He stood there longer than necessary. He thought of pride, of blind spots, of how easy it had been. Before Annie spoke up that first day, to dismiss the possibility that help could come from unexpected places. He thought of the moment Annie had stood so calmly and said Daisy could find Lily. How he had almost not listened. Almost. The word unsettled him more than Victor ever had. He returned inside. Daisy lifted her head as he passed. "Good night," he murmured. Her tail tapped twice against the hardwood. Upstairs, Lily slept soundly. Across town, Annie lay in her own bed beneath a quilt Maria had sewn years ago. Daisy would spend the night there. Daniel had insisted, not because he was afraid, but because loyalty deserved consistency. Outside, the first snow of the season continued to fall. Soft, persistent, quiet strength covering sharp edges. And in the stillness, something had shifted. The estate was still guarded, still wealthy, still powerful, but it was no longer isolated. It was connected, bound not by contracts or influence, but by the simple truth that sometimes the smallest voice in the yard sees the danger first, and sometimes the greatest strength is learning to listen. By early spring, the air around Chestnut Street no longer carried the bite of winter. It carried the smell of fresh bread. Kira's Cafe had grown quietly popular over the past months, not because of marketing, not because of spectacle, but because people lingered there. They talked. They felt seen. The exposed brick walls held warmth. The espresso machine hissed like a steady heartbeat. White ceramic cups lined the shelves with practical simplicity. Daniel sat at his usual stool near the counter. Black coffee, no sugar, no milk. Kira placed it in front of him without asking. "You're early today," she observed lightly. "Board meeting ended faster than expected," he replied. She raised an eyebrow. Miracles do happen. Across the room, Lily and Annie were finishing homework at their usual table near the window. Daisy lay beneath them, her coat shinier now. Arthritis controlled by steady care and medication, Daniel had insisted on arranging without calling it charity. The cafe bell jingled as regulars entered. Retired couples, a mail carrier, a middle-aged man who came every Thursday for waffles and conversation. The kind of crowd that noticed things, the kind of crowd that remembered. An older gentleman approached Annie's table. "You're the young lady with the hero dog, aren't you?" he asked gently. Annie glanced at Daisy. "She doesn't think she's a hero." The man smiled. "The best ones never do." Daniel watched the exchange quietly. A year ago, he would have considered this vulnerability attention tied to a past event. Now he saw something different. Community memory. And community memory protects. Mid-morning sunlight slanted through the window. Kira leaned against the counter beside Daniel. "You're thinking again," she said. "Is it that obvious?" "Yes." He turned the coffee cup slowly between his hands. "When I was younger," he began carefully, "my father used to say control was strength." Kira listened without interrupting. "I believed him," Daniel continued, "until I realized control without compassion becomes isolation." Kira dried a glass slowly. "And isolation makes blind spots," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That day in the yard, I almost didn't listen." "But you did," Kira replied. "That was Annie." Kira looked toward her daughter. "No," she said gently. "That was you choosing." "Oh," Daniel absorbed that. Across the cafe, Lily held up a drawing to Annie. It was another house with a red roof and yellow walls. But this one had something new. A small cafe beside it, and wild daisies planted outside both. Annie laughed. "You forgot Daisy's ears," she teased. Lily added 2 oversized ears to the giant gray dog in the center. Under the drawing, she wrote carefully, "Home is where someone listens." Daniel saw it. He did not comment, but the words stayed. That afternoon, after the cafe quieted, Daniel stepped outside into the mild air. He walked to the park bench across the street where he and Kira had once sat, carefully spaced apart. The trees were beginning to bud. He thought about Victor Hale, about pride and resentment, about how close he had come to letting ego override attention. Victor had not contacted them again. The restraining order held. Reports indicated compliance. Daniel did not feel triumph. He felt resolution. Back inside the cafe, Annie knelt beside Daisy. "Good job," she whispered, scratching behind her ear for no specific reason. Daisy leaned into the touch. No crises, no threat, just presence. Daniel returned to his stool. "Do you ever think about leaving this city?" he asked Kira quietly. She considered it. "Every time rent was due," she admitted. "And now?" She shook her head. "No. Now this feels earned." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood that word deeply. Earned, not bought, not imposed. Earned. The cafe bell rang again. A group of middle-aged women entered, laughing loudly about a book club disagreement. The room filled with noise. Warm, ordinary noise. Daniel glanced toward Lily. She was explaining something animatedly with her hands, Daisy's head rising every time her voice lifted. Annie watched her with steady attention. Daniel felt something settle inside him. Peace, not the fragile kind that comes from absence of conflict, the durable kind that comes from weathering it. As he stood to leave, Kira stopped him briefly. "You don't have to come every week," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But you do." He smiled faintly. "Yes." Outside, the breeze carried the scent of coffee and budding trees. Across the street, children ran in the park, their laughter echoing freely. Daniel paused before getting into his car. He looked back at the cafe window, at Annie, at Lily, at Daisy, at the daisies in the flower box beneath the glass. A year ago, he had believed power meant insulation. Now he understood power meant responsibility. And sometimes responsibility meant sitting on a cracked concrete step and listening to a 6-year-old say something impossible with absolute certainty. "My dog can find your daughter." He had almost missed the truth in that sentence. He would not miss it again. The first anniversary of the night Daisy found Lily arrived without announcement. No one marked it on a calendar. No one planned a speech. But Daniel woke that morning with the memory already waiting. He stood at the bedroom window watching early light spread over the lawn. Spring had fully arrived now. The oak tree in the yard wore new leaves, bright and tender. The grass freshly cut. A year, 12 months since fear had hollowed out his chest. 12 months since a 6-year-old girl had stood steady in front of him and offered hope without hesitation. He dressed quietly and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Lily was already awake, pouring cereal into a bowl. "You're up early," Daniel said. She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." He studied her face. She looked older now, 7 going on 8. Stronger, less fragile. "Do you remember what today is?" he asked gently. Lily paused, spoon hovering above milk. "The day Daisy found me," she said simply. He nodded. She didn't look afraid. She looked reflective. "I don't like thinking about the dark part," she admitted. "But I like thinking about when you yelled my name." Daniel swallowed quietly. "I like that part too." Across town, Annie sat at the small kitchen table in Kira's apartment, braiding a thin ribbon into Daisy's collar. "Why the ribbon?" Kira asked, sipping her morning coffee. "It's her brave day," Annie replied matter-of-factly. Kira smiled softly. "She's brave every day." Annie considered that. "Yeah," she agreed. "But today she saved Lily." Kira reached across the table and squeezed Annie's hand. "And you saved someone too." Annie shook her head quickly. "No, I just told the truth." Kira's expression softened. That's usually how saving starts. Late that morning, Daniel drove himself to Chestnut Street. He did not call ahead. The cafe door chimed as he entered. The smell of fresh blueberry muffins greeted him. Kira looked up from behind the counter. "You look like you're remembering something," she said quietly. "I am." She nodded slowly. Annie and Lily were already at their usual table, drawing. Daisy lay between them, ribbon neatly tied around her thick gray neck, white scar catching the light. Daniel approached. "Special occasion?" he asked. Annie looked up proudly. "It's Daisy's brave day." Daniel crouched beside her. "It is." Lily smiled at him. "We're making her a certificate." Daniel glanced at the paper. In large, uneven letters it read, "Daisy Whitmore's best friend and protector." He chuckled softly. "I think she'd approve." Daisy thumped her tail once. Daniel straightened and turned toward Kira. "I was standing on the balcony that night," he said quietly, voice low enough that only she could hear. "I don't think I ever told you that." Kira's hand stilled on the counter. "No," she replied gently. "I didn't think I could survive losing her." Kira met his eyes. "But you didn't lose her." "No," he said, "because someone else didn't look away." The cafe buzzed around them, ordinary and alive. A retired couple argued softly about crossword answers at a corner table. A middle-aged man typed on a laptop, sipping coffee slowly. Life continued. Kira stepped closer. "You came here today because you needed to see that," she said. Daniel didn't deny it. "Yes." At noon, the small bell above the cafe door rang again. Officer Riley entered. Not in uniform, just jeans and a light jacket. He approached Daniel casually. "Heard what today was," he said. Daniel extended his hand. Riley shook it firmly. "He's still compliant," Riley added quietly. "No violations." Daniel nodded. "I appreciate you." Riley looked toward Annie and Daisy. "Sometimes justice doesn't look dramatic," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's just boundaries holding." Daniel absorbed that. Across the room, Annie stood up suddenly. "Speech," she announced loudly. The cafe quieted with amused curiosity. Annie cleared her throat and held up the certificate. "Today is Daisy's brave day," she declared. She followed Lily's smell all the way to the music and didn't give up. And because she didn't give up, Lily came home. She looked down at Daisy. And because Daisy didn't give up, Mr. Whitmore didn't give up either. The room grew still. Daniel felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Annie continued, voice small but steady. "Sometimes grown-ups forget to listen, but Daisy doesn't forget." A few customers nodded quietly. Annie handed the paper to Daniel. "You can hang it somewhere," she said. Daniel accepted it carefully. "I will." Later that afternoon, Daniel drove home with the certificate resting on the passenger seat. He didn't place it in his office. He didn't frame it in the study. He hung it in the hallway outside Lily's bedroom, right above the place where Daisy had slept that first night. When Lily saw it, she smiled. "Dad?" "Yes, I'm not scared of that night anymore." He crouched beside her. "Why?" "Because the ending is louder than the dark part." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yes," he whispered. It is. That evening, the estate felt warm, not fortified, not guarded, just steady. Daisy lay at the foot of Lily's bed while Annie read aloud from a library book. Kira sat in the living room talking quietly with Maria about recipes and school schedules. Daniel stood at the doorway watching it all. A year ago, he had believed power meant control. Now he understood it meant humility. Humility enough to listen. Humility enough to admit he could not do everything alone. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently in the spring wind. Inside, laughter moved freely from room to room. And on the wall, in uneven handwriting, a certificate hung as a reminder. Protection is loyalty in motion. Summer returned the way it always did without apology. The air turned thick and golden. Cicadas hummed in the trees, and the world felt wide again. At Whitmore Estate, the oak tree cast a broad circle of shade over the lawn where Lily and Annie now lay on their stomachs, reading paperback mysteries. Daisy rested between them, sides rising and falling in slow rhythm, content but never unaware. Daniel watched from the patio, sleeves rolled, tie long abandoned for the season. Across the yard, laughter rose and drifted easily. He thought about how different this sound had once felt fragile, almost borrowed. Now it felt permanent, not because danger no longer existed, but because fear no longer owned the house. Maria stepped outside with iced tea and handed him a glass. "You look like a man who survived something," she said gently. Daniel smiled faintly. "I did. And I learned." She studied him. "What?" He glanced toward Annie. "That strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up." Maria followed his gaze. Annie was explaining something to Lily, hands moving animatedly. Daisy lifted her head as if participating in the discussion. "They've grown," Maria said softly. Yes, Lily had grown taller, steadier. Annie's voice carried more confidence, now less careful, less guarded. Daniel sometimes wondered if children knew how much they changed adults. Later that afternoon, the girls insisted on walking to the small neighborhood park 2 blocks away. Mark accompanied them at a distance, not obvious, not intrusive. Daniel had loosened the perimeter over time, not recklessly, intentionally. You cannot teach courage while modeling fear. At the park, Lily climbed the old metal jungle gym while Annie sat on a bench tying Daisy's leash to the armrest. "You don't have to tie her," Lily called. "I know," Annie replied. "She just likes to stay close." Daisy thumped her tail. A group of older boys played basketball on the cracked court nearby. One of them glanced at Daisy. "That dog's huge," he muttered. Annie looked up calmly. "She's gentle." The boy shrugged. "Still looks scary." Annie didn't bristle. "Sometimes scary means safe," she said simply. The boy looked at her, then at Daisy, and nodded once. Across the street, Daniel observed quietly. He noticed something else, too. People no longer stared at Annie as much, no longer whispered about the help's daughter. They greeted her. They greeted Daisy. The story had shifted, not because Daniel had demanded it, because Annie had earned space through truth. When the girls returned home near sunset, Daniel met them at the gate. "Good walk?" he asked. Lily grinned. Daisy scared some pigeons. Annie corrected her gently. She relocated them. Daniel laughed softly. That night, after dinner, the family gathered in the backyard for a small bonfire in a contained stone pit Daniel had installed after Lily begged for summer traditions. Fireflies blinked in the grass. The sky deepened into indigo. Annie roasted marshmallows with careful precision. Kira sat beside Maria, their shoulders nearly touching now without awkwardness. Daisy lay at Annie's feet, watching sparks rise. Daniel leaned back in his chair. A year ago, he would not have imagined this scene. Not the blending of households, not the quiet ease, not the absence of guarded tension. "Dad?" Lily said softly. "Yes? Are we ever going to move?" Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "Why? I like it here," she said. "But I don't want it to be because we're hiding." He shook his head slowly. "We're not hiding." Annie glanced up at him. "We're just living," she added. Daniel felt a small tightening in his chest, not fear. Pride. "Yes," he said. "We are." The fire crackled gently. In the glow, Daisy's white scar caught the light like a thin line of history. A reminder, not of danger, of loyalty. Daniel stood after a while and walked toward the oak tree. He placed his hand against the bark. This was where the phone had been found, where suspicion had once crept along the hedge line. Now it was just wood and shadow, memory without power. Behind him, Annie's voice rose again. Daisy, you're not allowed to eat burnt marshmallows. Daisy's tail thumped in protest. Laughter followed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He had once believed justice required force. Now he understood something quieter. Justice sometimes looked like a restraining order, sometimes like community attention, sometimes like choosing not to let bitterness grow roots, and sometimes it looked like trusting a child who said something impossible. He returned to the fire. Kira handed him a stick with a perfectly toasted marshmallow. Peace offering, she said lightly. For what? For thinking too much. He accepted it. You know, he said after a moment, I used to think I was protecting Lily from the world. Kira tilted her head. And now I think she's teaching me how to live in it. Kira smiled. That's what children do. Across the yard, Lily and Annie were drawing shapes in the dirt with sticks. A house, a tree, a big dog. And this time, they drew the oak tree larger than the house. Roots deep, branches wide, home not as fortress, home as shelter. The fire burned low. Stars appeared overhead. Daisy shifted closer to the girls, always positioning herself between them and the open yard. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to stand guard, because loyalty was already standing there. Autumn returned again, but this time it arrived without memory pressing against it. Leaves drifted down Chestnut Street in slow spirals of gold and amber. The air carried the scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans, and Kira's cafe was fuller than it had ever been. 1 year and a season had changed many things. Lily was 8 now. Annie had turned 7 that summer. Daisy moved a little slower, but her eyes were as steady as ever, dark, watchful, kind. On a bright Saturday afternoon, the cafe hummed with conversation. A local high school jazz trio played softly near the window. Retired couples lingered over pie. Parents talked about school fundraisers and football games. At the corner table, Lily and Annie were working on a new drawing. It was bigger than the others, more detailed. Daniel sat at the counter, coffee untouched in front of him. He wasn't distracted. He was listening to the sound of ordinary life, to the rhythm of safety that no longer felt fragile. Kira approached with a small smile. You're staring at the coffee again. He looked up. I like knowing it's there. She leaned on the counter across from him. That's a very billionaire answer. He almost laughed. It's a very father answer. Across the room, Annie raised her hand. Mr. Whitmore? Daniel turned immediately. Yes? We finished. He walked over slowly. The drawing showed a house with a red roof and yellow walls. But this time it was different. The house stood open doors wide, windows bright. Outside were wild daisies planted in careful rows. Beside the house stood a cafe with striped awnings. Behind them, an oak tree stretched high, branches strong. In the center, 2 children stood holding hands. Between them was Daisy, oversized and smiling in the way only children could draw. Behind the children stood 4 adults, not towering, not distant, standing together. Above it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "We are safe because we stand together." Daniel felt something steady settle inside his chest. Not the sharp relief of crisis avoided. Not the trembling gratitude of a child found. Something deeper. Completion. He crouched beside them. It's beautiful, he said quietly. Lily beamed. Annie said we should draw the oak tree bigger. Annie shrugged shyly. It's strong. Daniel nodded. Yes, it is. Daisy shifted and rested her head against Annie's knee. Officer Riley entered the cafe just then, removing his hat with a nod. No urgency. No flashing lights. Just a man stopping by for coffee. Daniel stood and shook his hand. All quiet, Riley said. Daniel smiled. That's my favorite kind of update. Riley glanced toward the girls. They've grown. Yes, Daniel replied softly. They have. As the afternoon light angled through the windows, Daniel stepped outside for a moment alone. Chestnut Street bustled gently, neighbors greeting neighbors, shop doors opening and closing, the world turning without fear. He walked to the park bench across the street, the same bench where he had once confessed that he nearly didn't want morning to come. He sat, closed his eyes briefly. He could still remember the sound of Lily's voice echoing through the tunnel of that long-ago night. He could still remember Annie standing steady, offering hope without trembling. He could still remember Daisy's claws striking pavement as she ran without hesitation. Those memories were no longer sharp. They were carved, foundations, not wounds. A small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Whitmore?" He opened his eyes. Annie stood a few feet away, Daisy at her side. "Yes. Are you thinking again?" He smiled faintly. "I am. About the bad stuff?" He shook his head slowly. "No. About the good stuff." She considered that. "Good stuff is louder," she said confidently. He nodded. "Yes, it is." She glanced back toward the cafe. "Mom says sometimes justice isn't loud. It's just steady." Daniel looked at her, surprised. "She's right." Annie squinted at him thoughtfully. "You look different now." "How?" "You don't look like you're about to lose something." He let out a quiet breath. "Because I'm not." She nodded once, satisfied. Daisy leaned against his leg briefly before turning back toward the cafe door. Loyalty never strayed far. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, the families gathered in the small park beside the cafe. No ceremony, no speeches, just blankets spread on grass and thermoses of coffee passed around. Lily ran ahead, Annie close behind, Daisy lumbering faithfully after them. Daniel and Kira sat on the bench, not distant, not close enough to draw attention. Comfortable, Maria joined them a moment later. The children began drawing in the dirt again with sticks. A house, an oak tree, wild daisies, a big dog. Daniel watched silently. He had once believed power meant never needing help. He had once believed safety meant building walls high enough that nothing could climb them. He had once believed justice meant retaliation. Now he understood something quieter. Safety meant listening. Strength meant humility. Justice meant drawing boundaries and standing steady behind them. And sometimes, the person who saves you is the one the world almost overlooked. Annie stood suddenly and called out across the grass, "Daisy, do you know you're a hero?" Daisy tilted her head slightly, then trotted toward her. Kira laughed softly. "I don't think she knows," she said. "She doesn't need to," Daniel replied. The children collapsed into giggles as Daisy licked Lily's cheek. The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched long but no longer felt threatening. They felt peaceful. Daniel leaned back against the bench and watched the scene before him. Two girls who once stood on opposite sides of power now stood side by side in friendship. A dog once discarded now stood as protector. A mother once unseen now stood respected. And a man once certain he controlled everything now understood the quiet power of simply listening. The world had not changed entirely. There would always be danger somewhere. There would always be pride, resentment, blind spots. But here, in this park, under this sky, something had shifted permanently. Fear no longer led. Love did. Annie looked up at Daniel one last time that evening. "My dog can find your daughter," she said playfully, echoing the words that had once changed everything. Daniel smiled. She already did. And as autumn leaves drifted down around them, no one felt sung sir anymore. They felt steady. They felt home. This story reminds us that real strength does not always come from power, wealth, or status. Sometimes it comes from the courage to speak up, the humility to listen, and the loyalty to stand beside one another. A child's faith, a mother's dignity, and a rescued dog's devotion succeeded where influence and control could not. The lesson is simple but profound. Never underestimate those the world overlooks, and never ignore the quiet voice offering help. Justice is not always loud, and protection is not always forceful. Often, it is steady love, shared responsibility, and the decision to stand together that truly keeps us safe. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.